How do you build a first world nation literally out of thin air? Well, today we're unraveling one of the most astonishing transformations in modern human history. We are looking at the incredible story of how a tiny, incredibly vulnerable island launched a relentless 50-year siege on poverty to become an absolute global economic powerhouse.
Just look at this stark contrast. Back in the 1960s, Singapore was, well, it was a sleepy, muddy, mosquito-infested slum with absolutely zero natural resources to its name. But today, it's a wealthy, hyper-efficient, neon-lit metropolis. Now, to really understand how they achieved this miraculous leap from a third-world swamp to a first-world tiger, we have to go back to the exact moment they almost lost it all.
So, picture this, August 9th, 1965. The leader of this brand new nation, Kuan Yew, goes on national television and just weeps. But actually, he wasn't crying tears of joy. Far from it. He was crying because he genuinely thought his country was doomed. Singapore had just been entirely expelled from Malaysia. They were completely alone, facing a literal existential crisis. And honestly, the rest of the world fully expected them to fail.
To really grasp this vulnerability, let's take a quick look at their history. For centuries, Singapore relied heavily on outside empires. In 1819, the British set it up as this perfect trade toll booth between India and China. And, everyone thought the British were this impenetrable fortress. But then, in 1942, a Japanese invasion straight through the jungle exploited a massive blind spot and completely shattered that illusion of invincibility. It proved that relying on others just leaves your backside totally exposed. So by the time they merged with Malaya and were suddenly kicked out in 1965, centuries of depending on others had left this newborn nation completely vulnerable and surrounded by larger, hostile neighbors.
And when you look at the sheer scale of the engineering problem Kuan Yew faced here, it's staggering. I mean, zero natural resources, absolutely no military defense to speak of. Unemployment was just through the roof. And perhaps most terrifyingly, they didn't even have enough fresh water to drink. They were relying entirely on the very neighbors who had just kicked them out. But instead of giving up, Kuan Yew treated every single one of these massive vulnerabilities as a specific mechanical threat to be solved.
Which brings us to engineering problem number 1, the water crisis. Now what's fascinating is how they viewed this absolute lack of drinking water. It wasn't a death sentence for them, it was simply the very first obstacle to engineer their way out of. I mean, think about it. If an angry neighbor could just turn off the tap and kill them of thirst, they didn't really have a country at all, right?
So, to achieve total water independence, they had to get incredibly creative. They ordered almost the entire island to be covered in water catchment areas. They transformed everyday building roofs into active rain collectors, literally turning every available surface into a vital resource. And they leaned heavily into technology, aggressively developing advanced seawater desalination. They engineered it so that their neighbors could never, ever use water as a weapon against them again. Imagine if your neighbor could just turn off your tap. Insane, right?
Okay, engineering problem number 2, a flailing economy. Having miraculously secured their water supply, they instantly pivoted to the next massive challenge, building an economy completely from scratch. And keep in mind, we're talking about the 1960s here. This was an era where most developing nations were throwing up massive trade walls and chasing self-sufficiency.
But Kuan Yew, he looked at what his peers were doing and he did the exact opposite. Knowing a tiny island couldn't survive alone, he practically begged foreign companies to set up shop. He offered this incredibly stable, super profitable environment by enforcing absolute zero corruption, extremely low taxes, and a remarkably strict rule of law. So while other nations closed their doors, Singapore intentionally positioned itself as the hyper-efficient bridge between the East and the West.
Next up, engineering problem number 3, overcrowded slums. Because here's the thing, generating vast amounts of wealth at the trading port meant absolutely nothing if the citizens were still living in unhygienic, fire-prone, overcrowded slums. You just can't build a thriving, modern nation on top of a swamp of squalor. They needed an immediate, highly structural housing solution.
Let's dive into the mechanical genius of their solution. It was this forced savings masterstroke called the Central Provident Fund. Basically, every worker had a mandatory portion of their wages saved. The Housing Development Board then took those massive pooled funds and used them to build public infrastructure at an absolute breakneck pace. Finally, citizens could use their mandated savings to actually buy those government-built apartments. It was a win-win. The government got the vital cash flow it desperately needed, and the citizens got a literal financial stake in the nation's survival.
And to put the sheer impact of that single policy into perspective, just look at this number. By the 1980s, over 80% of the entire population lived in public housing that they actually owned themselves. They transformed a population of slum dwellers into a nation of deeply invested homeowners in just a single generation. Incredible.
So with housing stabilized, we hit engineering problem number 4, a divided workforce. With literally zero natural resources in the ground, Kuan Yew recognized early on that the people, the human capital, were the only assets Singapore had. He had to rapidly unify a highly diverse, historically divided mix of Chinese, Malay, and Indian citizens into a single, cohesive economic engine. Sure, they rapidly constructed schools across the entire island, but the true masterstroke here? Making English the mandatory language of instruction. By doing this, the government essentially created a neutral, unifying language that completely neutralized deep racial tensions. And at the exact same time, this one single policy instantly plugged their entire workforce directly into the international economy. It made them flawlessly fluent in the language of global business overnight. Finally, engineering problem number 5, hostile neighbors. You see, success kind of breeds its own unique dangers. All this newly generated wealth, the gleaming new housing, the booming trade, it basically painted a massive, shiny target on the map. This tiny island urgently needed a way to deter the much larger, aggressive empires surrounding them from simply marching in and taking it all. Their solution was rooted in a very strict military doctrine, summarized perfectly by this quote from Kuan Yew himself: "Make Singapore poisonous to swallow." They introduced mandatory military service for every able-bodied male. And the goal here wasn't just defense, it was raw deterrence. They ensured that any invading force, no matter how large, would pay such a devastatingly high cost in blood and treasure that attacking Singapore would simply never be worth the trouble. All right, now we come to the uncomfortable truth, the actual price of the miracle. Because to fully understand this incredible 50-year rise, we really have to look at the underlying system that made it all possible. The reality is, this rapid, unprecedented success did not happen through unchecked Western-style democracy. It happened through a highly specific framework, often called Asian values. This is a political and social system famously championed by Kuan Yew that unapologetically places collective stability, social harmony, and economic growth far above individual personal liberties. It's a system entirely built on prioritizing absolute order over any risk of chaos.
And this stark historical trade-off is laid out perfectly right here. On one side, you have the famously strict laws, physical caning for vandalism, heavy fines for littering, that famous ban on chewing gum, and a very tight grip on the media and political opposition. But then, mapped directly against that, you have the undeniable, highly structured prosperity it produced. Immaculately clean streets, practically non-existent crime rates, soaring literacy, and absolute unwavering stability. It was a very calculated, deliberate exchange.
So, bypassing the empires. Ultimately, Kuan Yew's ruthless efficiency proved that what looks like an impossible geopolitical death sentence is often just an engineering problem waiting to be solved. In just 50 years, this discarded, muddy fishing village bypassed the very empires that once colonized it, achieving a staggering GDP per capita that is today higher than both the United Kingdom and the United States. It is a powerful reminder of the invisible scaffolding required to build modern wealth in a world of ruthless competition. Which leaves us with a fascinating question for you to ponder. Look at the incredible results on one hand and the strict societal controls on the other. Would you trade a piece of your individual personal freedom for this level of extreme, guaranteed prosperity? Let me know exactly where you stand in the comments below. And hey, if you want to keep unraveling the blueprints of global power and wealth with us, make sure to hit that subscribe button and join Clarity Capital. Let the debate begin.